Hello everyone, how are you? I hope you are doing well. So today we are going to begin with a new lesson, which is from trade to territory. So what we will learn in this chapter, let's see. So here do you see the subheading, the company establishes power. So in history, in this year, we are going to learn about how the East India Company came into force and how did it reach India. So in this chapter, we'll learn about how the East India Company, the company which was responsible for capturing the whole Indian subcontinent at that time, it came into existence in India. So in this chapter, what we are going to learn. So these are all the topics that we are going to cover in this chapter. First of all, we'll see that East India Company comes to East, as in from Britain. It comes towards the East to India, and how did it establishes its feet in India. Then we will see how it begins their trade in Bengal, how the trade and mercantile began in Bengal. As we have discussed that since the East Indian Company establishes its feet in the Indian subcontinent in Bengal, there were a lot of battles that took place in order to conquer and deal with the revenue system. Then we will see how trades led to battles. So, as soon as the East India Company came to India, there were a lot of battles involving trade. So, what were those? Then we will see how Battle of Plassey and what was it and when was it taken place. Then we will see company officials, they become nabobs. We will see what is nabobs, where did this term come from, who were referred to as nabobs, we will see that. In the second part of this video, in the second part of this chapter, we will learn about the company rule expands. How did the East India Company manage to expand its rule and conquer different parts, provinces and states of India? Who was Tipu Sultan and why is he called the Tiger of Mysore? Then we will see war with the marathon. So what is it about? What was the war about? Then the claim to the paramount. Do you know what is a paramount? The top of a hill is known as a paramount. So there was always a competition with the East India Company to reach the paramount. So we'll see that. The doctrine of lapse. This is a very important topic in this chapter, which is the doctrine of lapse. We'll see and study this in detail. Then in the end, we will see setting up a new administration. So as the East India Company started to expand its administration, it needed a new structure to govern and administer its tasks and activities in the country. So we will see what was the new administrative policies. The company army, of course, to control such a big continent, such a big subcontinent, the company, it required an army. So how did the East India Company, it turned into an army? We'll see that. So let's begin. So to give you an overview, in the last classes, in the previous classes, in history books, you have studied that Indian continent, Indian subcontinent, it was not just ruled by one ruler. There were several dynasties which ruled the Indian subcontinent over a period of time. The last dynasty being the Mughal dynasty, the Mughal Empire. So, as you can see here, here is a picture of a Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb. So, Aurangzeb is known to be the last emperor or ruler of the Mughal Empire. So, after his death, after Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughal governors, who were known as the Subedars, and the big zamindars, the people, the landowners, the big zamindars, they started to assert and rule on their own. So there was not one focal point who would supervise the whole administration or rule over the people. So these small powers such as the Subedars, the zamindars, they started to begin and assert their power and authority, setting up regional kingdoms which are small in nature. So some powerful regional kingdoms, they emerged in various parts of India after Aurangzeb's death. So Delhi could not function as an effective center since there was no head or center point to govern and administer. No one powerful focal point. These small people, they divided their kingdoms and these powerful regional kingdoms came into emergence. A new power named the British began emerging at that time. Of course, if there is no unity, not everybody, or if there is not one single power who could lead the nation, in that case, the power is divided and scattered. So, at that time, the Britishers, they started to come to India. Earlier, it was just for trade, but now they started to expand their political and social horizons as well. So now here in this slide you see a picture of Bahadur Shah and his sons being arrested by Captain Hudson. So here is Bahadur Shah, who was one such powerful regional king, and he has been arrested by Captain Hudson of British East Indian Company. After the revolt of 1857 was put down, Bahadur Shah was put in prison. They all were put in prison, he with his sons, and they were executed. After Aurangzeb, there was no powerful Mughal ruler. There was not one ruler who had the power to guide the whole nation. So, what happened at that time? Mughal emperors, they continued to be symbolically important. However, there was not one ruler, but at the same time, there was a cultural and social benefit of which they were reaping fruits. So, they were still valued. So, as we studied that in the rebellion of 1857, there was a massive rebellion against the British rule in India. Bahadur Shah Zafar and his followers, his sons, they took the lead in this new rebellion. So, once the revolt was put down, the company, they arrested Bahadur Shah Zafar and his sons, and they were put into prison and executed thereon. So, here we see that how the British East India Company, the East India Company or the trade company of the Britishers, they came from Britain to India. So, now let's talk about that how did this British East Indian Company or the East Indian Company, it came to the east, it came to India. How did they reach India? So, earlier there were no planes that you can take a plane and go anywhere, right? So, they had to discover the route to India on their own. There were no maps, there was no Google Maps at that time, right? So, what was the discovery and how did they reach India? Let's see. So, here in the map, as you can observe, that the British East India Company, it came from the British Islands, the Great Britain. So, they came to India through a sea route, through the sea. They reached the Kappa of Good Hope, which is known as modern day Cape Town and St. Johannesburg in South Africa. After that, they moved towards the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, towards the Bay of Bengal, where they set up their ports in Madras and Calcutta. So, it was in Tamil Nadu and Bengal and their regional capitals respectively that they set up their first ports. After that, towards the Arabian Sea, they reached Bombay, which is in Maharashtra. So, these were the three major cities which were first conquered or approached by the Britishers. So, let's see further that how the East India Company, it established its roots into the Indian subcontinent and held that for 200 and more years. Let's have a look. So, in England, in Great Britain, in 1600, the rule was of Queen Elizabeth I. Okay, she was the Queen of England. So, in 1600, Queen Elizabeth, she issued a contract, a trade contract to the East India Company. Now, what did this contract mean? It was known as a charter by the monarchy or by the queen. What did this charter contain? What was the document about? Let's have a look. So, as you can see here that in 1600, the East India Company acquired a charter from the ruler of England, Queen Elizabeth I. So, what was there? Let's see. So, Queen Elizabeth, she granted the sole right of trading with the East to the East Company. Okay. So, East Indian Company was the company who had the sole power or the monopoly to trade with the Eastern countries. That consisted all of Asia. So, under this, it meant that no other trade company from Britain or from any part of England, they could function, trade or they could merchandise with the East. So, with this charter, the company could venture across oceans. They could move across oceans, they could trade and sell their products, buy the products, etc. It could look for new lands. So, of course, this was an opportunity for discovering new domains of trade and for making money and profits. So, they could find new lands to trade. Apart from that, from them, it would buy products at cheap price. So, the main goal of this trade was that all these Asian countries, they have very good resources, natural resources in form of spices, gold, diamonds, etc. There were plenty of metals, plenty of semi-precious stones, etc. which were important. So this was a time for the East India Company as well as the monarchy, the Queen of England, the ruler of England, to take these products at a very cheap and reasonable prices and sell them at a very huge price in their continent to the people and earn huge profits. So the whole idea was to gain profits. The company, they did not have any fear of competition because it had the sole proprietorship or the sole monopoly of the whole trading market towards the east. Now, let's talk about mercantile. Whenever we talk about trade, what is trade? Trade is exchange of goods and services, isn't it? But what does it involve? So, mercantile is one term which is used for trade at that time as well. So, a business enterprise, a mercantile is a business enterprise, organization or institution that makes huge profit primarily through trade. That means buying of goods at cheaper price and selling them at higher prices so that they can book a higher profit margin. So, as you can have a look here, mercantile trading companies in those days made profit primarily by trading. So, it was not based on services of any kind, but it was only based on goods and commodities, the tangible items. For example, cloth, spices, semi-precious stones, metals, etc. So, they could buy these items, these products and raw materials at a very low price and sell them at a higher price. So, was the Royal Charter successful for the East India Company? Now the question comes in account that the Queen, it issued and it gave monopoly to the East India Company to have trade with the eastern countries. Now how was it beneficial and successful for the company? How did it act as favorable towards the company? Let's have a look. So, the Royal Charter, which was issued by the Queen, it was very successful for the East Indian Company. As we can look at the history, they ruled on India and many different countries in Asia for more than 200 years. So, why was it successful? Because the East India Company, it had the monopoly, it had the sole right to trade with the East and Asian countries. Other than that, other than East India Company, no British company was allowed or chartered to do trade. So, in that way, it gained every favorable outcome. So, but also there were some failures. So, there were few things that even the Europeans, they could not prevent. So, the British companies, the other British companies, they failed at entering the foreign markets towards the east because of this charter given to the East Indian Company. So, as we saw in the map, the British ships, they first shipped down towards the western part of South African continent. So, they reached the Cape of Good Hope, okay. So, they stopped there, they did their trade in Africa as well and they crossed the Indian Ocean. So, towards moving from the Cape of Good Hope, they reached the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese had already set up their presence on the western coast of India. So, as you know, Goa, which resides in the western coast of India, it was already a place where the Portuguese were trading. So, the doors were not open for Britishers to deal with the western coast of India as the Portuguese already reached there. There was a lot of competition as compared to that. So, what did the Britishers do? What new things did they find? So, Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, he discovered this sea route to India in 1498. So, now here we need to note an important date and the name of a important explorer. So, here we need to note some important information. Now, since the first ships, they sailed down towards the west, they reached the Cape of Good Hope, okay. Then they crossed the Indian Ocean. So, the first thing was towards the Cape of Good Hope. Then they reached the Indian Ocean. Okay, but there was a challenge. What was that challenge? That the Portuguese had already set up their presence on the western coast of India, which consists of mainly Goa, Kerala, etc. Okay, you can still see that there is a very rich Portuguese culture in Goa. Now, what after that? Vasco da Gama was a Portuguese explorer who discovered the route to India first in 1498. Okay, So after that, by the start of the 17th century, the Dutch too, the Dutch people from Netherlands, they too were exploring the possibilities of trade in the Indian Ocean. Now why was that? Because Indian Ocean, the Indian subcontinent was very rich in natural resources, and there were a lot of things that could yield huge benefits to people. So in the start of 17th century, the Dutch too started exploring the Indian Ocean. Now, soon the French traders also arrived. So it was not just the Britishers, there were people from other parts of Europe as well. The Portuguese from Portugal, the Dutch from the Netherlands, the French from France, and Britishers of course from the Great Britain. So what was the reason behind the attraction, as we discussed, that why these all the people, they wanted to come to India for trade? So what was the reason behind this attraction? Let's see. First reason is that there was cheap and fine quality of silk available. Not just silk but cotton also. As we have discussed that textile industry in India, it's quite renowned even in today's time. So the first main point of attraction or fascination towards the trade was cloth. Silk and cotton, they were present in the Indian subcontinent at a very good quality and cheaper prices. Apart from that, there were spices like pepper. Pepper is known as the black gold. Then cloves, cardamom, cinnamon, etc. These spices, these became the central goods for trading companies to buy and sell. Now, the competition among the companies resulted in. Now, of course, there were so many companies coming from different parts of the globe, different countries of the Europe. There had some kind of competition among them. So what was the competition? So the competition was among the European companies coming from different countries. So this resulted in rise of prices. So the prices of these commodities that they used to purchase from the Indian dwellers, Indian vendors, they rose. So it ensured that the Indian traders were also receiving a handsome sum of money for whatever commodities or goods they were trading in. This reduced the profits of the company. So it was the contrary or the opposite effect on the company. Since the prices rose, the profit margin reduced, because again they could not increase the selling price ultimately. So the cost price increased, the profit margin decreased, and the selling price somewhere remained the same. So it was a loss situation for the companies. Now, amidst all these problems and the lack of profit margin that they were facing, there had to be a way for the companies to flourish. So they needed to find some kind of solution so that the East India Company could flourish and make huge profits again. So the only way the trading companies could flourish was elimination of the rival competitors. Of course, there were so many companies coming from so many different parts of the world. There was some part of the competition. In fact, there was a higher part of the competition. So what happens in today's time? For example, if I am selling bananas and just in front of me some other vendor is selling bananas at a very cheaper price, of course customers would go to him. So what can I do? Can I decrease my profit margin? I don't want to do that. So in that case, I would destroy my rival so that I have the monopoly and the only right to trade. So this is what the companies did. They started to eliminate the rival competitors. So this led to fierce battles. So as we were talking that the battles, a series of battles started. So what led was competition. So this led to fierce battles between different companies from different countries. So during the 17th and 18th century, they regularly sank each other's ships in the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea. So the battle did not include actually fighting in terms of with the weapons and everything, but it was a trade battle which included sinking of ships in the sea. They blocked routes, prevented rival ships from moving with supplies of goods. They used to block the roads, or they used to block the shipways and the seaways so that the rival ships could not enter the port. Trade was done on with arms. Now this is important to note. Whenever there was a trading company making trade with the local and the native people, it was only done under arms so that it could not be looted, it could not be burgled by some rival competitor. Trading posts were protected through fortification. So the trading posts where the companies set up their warehouses or godowns, these were protected by fortification, like big walls were built so that everything could be protected. Now, conflicts of the companies with local rulers. So apart from that, there were also conflicts of these companies with the local kings and rulers. Let's have a look at that. The effort to fortify settlements and carry on profitable trade led to intense conflict with the local rulers, because of course if some foreigner or some person who is not a native, he is coming to India, to your land, and building forts, that does not reflect good on the ruling party. So what happened there? The company found it difficult to separate trade from politics. There was a huge politics involved. The rulers, the native rulers, the local rulers, they felt threatened by the company, and there were conflicts between them. So East India Company first began its trade in Bengal. So as the western coast was occupied by the Portuguese, the only option left for the England and English people was to trade in the eastern part, which was the Bay of Bengal. So they first reached to Bengal. As you can see here in the image, they have given a beautiful image of the Howrah Bridge. So the first English company was set up on the banks of the river Hooghly. So this is Howrah Bridge and this is the river Hooghly in 1651. The first English company was set up in the year 1651 on the banks of river Hooghly in Bengal. So this is important to note. Now, the factory, they had warehouses, godowns from where the factors operated. Goods and commodities were stored there. Next, they persuaded merchants and traders to live near the factories so that huge amount of materials could be provided, goods could be provided and stored. And then they started fortifying by 1696. So the fortification to protect the goods and commodities from other companies, they started to build forts in 1696. So they bribed the Mughal officials. So there were Mughal zamindars, subedars who were there. They started to bribe them and got zamindari rights over 3 villages including Kalikata, which is now Kolkata. So after that, they were expanding. They wanted more power, more resources to earn revenue and local income as well. So what did they do? So from the Mughal zamindars and subedars, they took zamindari rights and they had 3 villages under them, including Kalikata, which is now known as Kolkata, which was the center point of trade for the British East Indian Company. Then they got the right of free trade as well. So earlier there were taxes, just like now we have taxes on trade. For example, if you are buying something, you have to give some amount of GST on it, isn't it? So earlier also there were some costs or taxes and tributes involved in trading. So they got right of free trade as they were not charged import duties, export duties or any other form of taxes, and they had more concessions and rebates under trade system. Gradually, through different means, they captured other territories as well. So it was not just 3 villages, few towns. They started expanding and they started capturing and conquering other areas as well. Now let's have a look what is Farman. Now, Farman is a royal edict, a royal order. So I am sure you all must have seen in movies or in photos that there is this long parcha kind of thing, long scroll presented by the king to issue his orders. So they got a Farman. The company, they persuaded the Mughal emperor Aurangzeb to issue a Farman, an order granting the company the right to trade duty free, so that there were no import export duties or other forms of taxes. So they got this Farman from Aurangzeb and now they did not have to pay a single penny to trade in India. The company, they manipulated the privileges given to them. They had the order from the queen. Then they also got the order from the Mughal emperor to trade freely. So manipulated the situations in their favor and had the privileges that were given to them. The company, they pressed for more concessions and manipulated the existing ones. So the Farman that was issued by Aurangzeb, that only granted them duty-free trade, but the company officials, they did not pay duty even for their own private trade. So it was not just about the trade that they were doing with the local people among themselves, but also for their private trade, as in what they were selling here. This caused revenue loss to Bengal, and the rulers, the subedars, the zamindars, the local rulers, they started to protest against this. So here you can see an image of one such port where ships and boats are coming and a big factory is being set up. So local bodies, they used to bring goods from ships in Madras. So this image is of Madras, which is painted by William Simpson in 1867. Now, how trade led to battles. As we discussed earlier, to remove competition, of course, the different companies, they started to battle against each other. So there were also battles among the Indian rulers and the East India Company. So after the death of Alivardi, Sirajuddaulah, he became the Nawab of Bengal. So the areas of conflict between Bengal Nawabs and the East India Company. So of course the East India Company first set up its feet and its root in Bengal. So there had to be some conflict. There was always conflict between the local zamindars, subedars and rulers with the East India Company. So what were the places and the areas of conflict? Why was there a conflict which resulted into big battles? So the areas of conflict between Nawabs of Bengal and East India Company were that the requests to grant concessions to the company. There were requests to grant concessions to the company, reason being that they needed a fair trade. So the Nawabs of Bengal and Bengal was suffering from a loss of revenue because the East India Company, it was allowed to trade duty free and they were manipulating the market. So there were requests to grant concessions. Now, apart from that, there was a demand of large tributes from the company for right to trade. The company, they started to actually demand huge amount of tributes and taxes in terms of right of trade. Apart from that, there was a denial of right to minting, which is making coins. Of course, it's not like nobody can produce currency. You and I, we cannot produce currency. It has to be under the government, under the ruler, isn't it? So what was the major conflict? That they were, the East India Company, they did not have the right to mint coins, to make coins, of course. Stoppage of fortification expansion. The East India Company, they wanted to build forts and do fortification around the factories in order to protect their commodities. But this was denied and it was stopped because that meant that the power was being given to the East India Company then to the local rulers. So the Nawabs, they claimed that the company was depriving the Bengal government of amount of revenue. So there must be some amount of revenue which was not being given to the Bengal government in terms of fair trade. So the East India Company, they started undermining the authority of Nawab. They started capturing areas. They started their own rules and policies. They started dictating their own policy and trade making system. So they were in a way undermining or overruling the authority of the Nawabs. Amidst all these conflicts, there were few actions which were taken by the company. So let's see what are these actions. They refused the payment of taxes to the government or to the Nawabs. The company, they totally refused to pay any kind of taxes to the government. So apart from that, they started to write disrespectful letters. So they were always undermining and disrespecting the authorities of the native and local rulers. Apart from that, they tried to humiliate the Nawabs and the officials. Enlargement of settlements were taking place by the company. They started to settle in areas without any prior information and permission from the Nawabs. Apart from that, they started buying villages because they had a lot of money. They started to buy villages and they started to rebuild the forts even when it was stopped by the Nawabs. So these were few totally out of hand things and activities and actions that were done and taken by the company, which resulted in huge long lasting conflicts between the native rulers and the Nawabs and the East India Company. Now, after the death of Aurangzeb, as Aurangzeb died, the Bengal Nawabs, they started to assert more power and autonomy. That was necessary also because the operations of East India Company, they were getting out of hand. Other regional powers were doing the same thing. The Bengal, Murshid Quli Khan was followed by Alivardi Khan and then Sajaruddaulah. As the Nawabs of Bengal, they started to control and assert their own power so that they could manage and become strong rulers. So, trade led to battle. So, as you see that there were conflicts between the company and the Nawabs, There was a long lasting list of actions which were quite disrespectful at the part of the company. So it resulted in long battles. So let's have a look. In the beginning of the 18th century, the conflict between the company and the Nawabs, it grew out of hand. It was intensified to a level that it completely became out of hand. Murshid Quli Khan, Ali Vardi Khan and Sijarudullah, they proved to be the strong rulers in the province of Bengal. They refused to grant the company concessions. So what did they do? They refused any kind of concessions to the company. They did not grant any kind of concessions, trade concessions or duty-free trade to them. So they also denied the right to mint coins. They were not allowed to make coins anymore. So they stopped it from extending the fortification. So these are the three important things that these Bengali rulers, these Nawabs, they implemented on the East India Company. So they accused the company of deceit and claimed that the company was depriving Bengal of some kind of revenue. Of course, they were not paying taxes, the company was not paying taxes. So the government revenue or the revenue which had to be gone to the state, it was being decreased. So there was a deprivation. The Nawabs also stated that the company, they were undermining the authority, the power and the respect of the Nawabs in Bengal. So this was one thing which totally resulted in battles and conflict, and it intensified over a period of time. The company, they refused to pay taxes. They wrote disrespectful notes and letters and tried to completely humiliate the Nawabs. The company realized that trade could not flourish if the duties were removed. So it was not just that the duties had to be removed in order to flourish and increase the trade, but there were other factors also. It was also convinced that to expand the trade, to develop and grow their trade and business, it had to enlarge settlement, land, etc. So they started building up and buying villages, and they started to build and rebuild the fortification and forts. These conflicts led to confrontations and finally culminated in the famous Battle of Plassey. So here you need to note one important thing. There were a lot of things that were happening. There were conflicts due to several reasons that we discussed earlier. Apart from that, they started to expand and enlarge its settlements. They started to build up villages and rebuild forts. This resulted in confrontations and led to the famous Battle of Plassey. So now you know why Battle of Plassey was fought. Now let's have a detailed look into the Battle of Plassey. I am sure you all must have heard about Battle of Plassey at some time or another. So let's see what it was. So after the death of Alwaradi Khan in 1756, Sirajudullah, he became the Nawab of Bengal. So the company became worrisome. They started to worry about the power of Sirajudullah. Rather, they wanted a Nawab or a ruler who was a puppet of their hands, who would just do as they ask for, as they request for. They wanted that trade concessions. They needed forgiving trade concessions and other kind of privileges to expand their settlements. So it tried to help one of the Sijarudullah's rival to become Nawab. So what did they do? They started playing politics. So they did not want Sijarudullah because he was very powerful and he would not favor the East India Company. Rather, what they did was they started to pair up with the rival of Sijarudullah and wanted him to become Nawab because he would play puppets of their hand. Angered, Sijarudullah asked the company to stop meddling in the political affairs of the subcontinent and of his dominion and stop the fortification and pay the revenues. So of course Sijarudullah was angered because it was not Britishers and the East Indian Company's place to actually meddle in between and play politics. So he asked them to pay revenues and stop fortification at all. So let's have a look at Battle of Plassey. Here you can see an image from the Battle of Plassey. When the negotiations they failed, the Nawabs they marched with 30,000 soldiers to the English factory. When all type of negotiations, diplomatic talks, it all failed, the Nawabs they marched with 30,000 soldiers to an English factory which is located in the Qasim Bazaar, and they captured the company officials. So it kind of started, a violent streak started, and it started by the Nawabs because they were so agitated that the company was not paying taxes, not paying the revenue, and they were building and expanding their settlements. So agitated by this, they went and marched with 30,000 soldiers to the English factory which is located in Qasim Bazaar. And what did they do there? They captured the company officials. So he locked the warehouse, disarmed all Englishmen and blocked English ships. So what happened there was that the warehouse that was locked, okay, Englishmen who were working in the factory, in the warehouse, they all were captured, and the way for the English ships, it was blocked. So yeah. So after this, he marched to Calcutta to establish control over the company's fort. So what did the Nawab do? So he marched to Calcutta in order to gain the control of the company fort as well. So when this news spread across Calcutta, the company officials in Madras, they sent their forces under the command of Robert Clive. So of course the company was not going to sit and watch what was happening in Bengal. After the news of Calcutta spread across the continent, the company officials in Madras, they sent their army and their forces under the command of Robert Clive. These forces, they were reinforced by naval fleets. So the British Navy and the naval fleets were there. These forces, they were reinforced with the help of the naval fleets. So at the same time, there were a lot of negotiations and diplomatic talks that were still going on with the Nawabs. Finally, in 1757, the Robert Clive, the company's army against Sijarudullah at Plassey. So apart from all the negotiations, talks, etc., finally, when no perfect solution was found, in 1757, Robert Clive sent and he led the company's army against Sijarudullah and at the place of Plassey. The English East Indian Company's forces were led by Robert Clive, whereas Sijarudullah's forces were led by Mir Jafar. So, his commanders who deceived and never fought the battle. So, there was a lot of agitation among and between the army of Sijarudullah. So, within the army, there were traitors. There were commanders and people who deceived him and did not ever fought that battle, which led to the decline of Sijarudullah's rule in Bengal. So, hence Nawab was defeated and Mir Jafar was made the Nawab. So, since there was a lot of deception involved, Mir Jafar took the place of Nawab and he played puppet through the hands of the East Indian Company. So, Robert Clive, he managed to secure Mir Jafar's support, okay, and promised to make him Nawab after defeating Sirajudullah. So, what did Robert Clive do? He sided with Mir Jafar, the commander-in-chief of Sirajuddaullah's army, and he promised that if he deceives Sirajudullah, he will become the next Nawab after him, and that is what happened. So, after that, it was widely believed that the mercantile East India Company was having territorial ambitions in India as well. So, it was not only restrained to the trade now. It was also about the territorial ambitions and to capture and colonize India as whole. Robert Clive wrote to explain that it is not difficult to possess the rich kingdoms of India. He also clarified that East India Company may not be able to take full advantage of the situation due to some or the other reasons. So, Mir Jafar was Sirajuddaullah's commander who sided with British in the Battle of Plassey and did not fight at all. Rather, he sided with the Britishers and he was the reason for the defeat of Sirajudullah. He was made the Nawab of Bengal after Sirajuddaullah's defeat. His relation with the British. So now, what were the relation between Mir Jafar and the British East India Company? So, later the relations soured. So, as they started as buddies or friends, they sided with each other in the Battle of Plassey. But later on, gradually, the relations they soured. So, Then after that, as the relations soured, Mir Qasim was installed as Nawab. So after Mir Jafar, Mir Qasim was installed as Nawab. He in turn was defeated in Battle of Buxar and Mir Jafar was reinstated. So after that there was a Battle of Buxar between Mir Jafar and Mir Qasim, and later on again Mir Jafar was reinstated as the Nawab of Bengal. He still remained the puppet in the hands of Britishers till his death in 1765. So, after the defeat of Plassey, Sijarudullah was assassinated, he was killed, he was murdered. Mir Jafar was made Nawab. The company, the East India Company, it expressed all kind of unwillingness and responsibility towards the occurrence of Battle of Plassey. Its prime objective was the expansion of trade. So the prime reason was to expand trade and earn profits. No responsibility for administrative duties was taken up by the company. Now let's talk about Battle of Buxar. As we studied earlier that there was a battle between Mir Qasim and Mir Jafar, who were fighting for being the Nawab of Bengal. So the Battle of Buxar took place. So let's have a look what was it about and what were the results of this battle. So Mir Qasim was defeated at the Battle of Buxar, which sealed the face of India. So after the defeat of Mir Qasim, that sealed the fate of India at the hands of the Nawabs of Bengal and the East India Company. The new Nawab, or I would say the old new Nawab, because Mir Jafar was already Nawab. So Mir Jafar has to pay 5 lakh. Okay. So Mir Jafar, he had to pay 5 lakh every month to the Britishers. Okay. So instead of taking revenue by the East India Company, the Nawab started to pay the company. And the company had right to trade freely. They were given the right to trade freely because he was acting as the puppet of the East India Company. So after Mir Jafar's death, the company got the Diwani rights. We will study about Diwani system in the later chapters of our book. So we will study about Diwani rights in the later chapters of the book. But after, you need to understand that after Mir Jafar's death, the company officials, the governors, they got Diwani rights and they started to collect revenue from the local and native people and the provinces of Bengal. So this is important to note. So here is an image of Battle of Plassey. Now, the company, they initially thought that with the help of all the privileges from the local rulers and the rights to free trade, they will be able to expand. But by the time Mir Jafar died in 1765, they realized that they must also conquer to expand the trade. It was not just the trade rights or the free trade that was helping them. They needed to expand and conquer in terms of settlements and land also. So here, as you can see, this is a general courtroom east. So here all the governors, officials are sitting and they make policies and discuss strategies. So India House. This is India House, which is located in the Lendal Street, the court of proprietors of the East India Company. They had their meetings in the East India House on Leadenhall Street in London. It is located in London. So now after that, the company got Diwani rights. What happened after that? The result of the company getting Diwani rights of Bengal in 1765. So as per the Diwani rights, the company was allowed to collect vast income and revenue from the province of Bengal. So they could actually collect revenue in place of zamindars from the cultivators, producers, weavers, craftsmen, etc. Revenue could now finance their trade, for example, purchase of cotton, spices, silk textiles, etc. It could help in maintaining troops as well, build fortification offices, expanding their settlements, etc. So, in 1765, Diwani right to the company benefited the company extremely. They could collect revenue, taxes, etc. from zamindars and others. Thus, it began to get finances to meet their expenditure for trade, etc. Now, let's have a look at the promise of riches. So the territorial ambitions of the mercantile East India Company were viewed with distrust. So nobody was trusting the East India Company in terms of their ambitions, and they doubt in England. After the Battle of Plassey, so Robert Clive wrote to William Pitt, one of the principal secretaries of the state to English monarch, on 7 January 1759 from Calcutta. So let's have a look at what he wrote. But so large a sovereignty may possibly be an object too extensive for a mercantile company. I flatter myself that there will be little or no difficulty in obtaining the absolute possession of these rich kingdoms. Now I leave you to judge whether an income yearly of 2 million sterling, sterling was the currency of Europe at that time, with the possession of 3 provinces be an object deserving the public attention. So they were able to make 2 million sterling of an yearly income, of an annual income, just through 3 villages. So the Nawab complaints. Second such document that we have is a complaint from a Nawab. In 1733, the Nawab of Bengal said this about the English traders. When they first came into the country, they petitioned to then government in a humble manner for liberty to purchase a spot of ground to build a factory, which was no sooner granted, but they built a strong fort instead, surrounded it with a ditch which has communication with the river, and mounted a great number of guns upon the walls. They have enticed several merchants, traders and others to go and take protection under them, and they collect a revenue which amounts to rupees 1 lakh. They rob and plunder and carry great number of kings' subjects of both sexes into slavery into their own country. So soon as initially as they came, they were quite humble because they needed the permission to trade. But gradually in this text we see how the power of the company rose. So the company officials become nabobs. So how did the company officials become nabobs? So most of the company officials did not succeed in making money like Clive. Many died at an early age. They had an early death in India due to disease and war. Moreover, they were all not corrupt and dishonest. There were some good people also. Many of them, they came from humble backgrounds, and their uppermost desire was to earn enough in India and return to Britain and lead a comfortable life. So those who collected wealth in India and returned to Britain, they led very flashy lives in Britain. They used to flaunt their riches. These people, they were called nabobs, an anglicized version of the word nawab. So the British officials, the company officials, they started to become the nawabs instead. They were often seen as upstarts and social climbers in British society, and were ridiculed or made fun of in plays and cartoons. So these nawabs, these were the people who collected the riches from India, and they led very flashy lives in Britain. They returned to Great Britain. So they were often known as the upstarts, the people who climbed the stairs to wealth and popularity. So they were social climbers in British society, and they were made fun of. They were mocked by cartoonists and playwrights. So why did Robert Clive committed suicide after the Battle of Plassey, after the winning of East India Company? What was the reason that he committed suicide? He killed himself. So after the defeat of actual native Nawabs in the Battle of Plassey, they were supposed and forced to give large amount of money, land, personal gifts to the company officials. Robert Clive himself, he amassed a fortune in India. He gained a lot of things and profited well. He had come to Madras, which is now known as Chennai, from England in 1743 at the age of 18, at such a young age. When in 1764 he finally left India after being Governor General twice, he had amassed almost 4,01,102 pounds. British Parliament took notice of this wealth and tried him. Of course, there must be something wrong. Nobody can earn such a huge amount in such a short period of time. It was too much. So the British court and the parliament, they noticed that something is wrong here and they set a trial on him in court. Though he was acquitted, he committed suicide later on in 1774. So, how did Clive see him? Now, after the suicide, how did he see him? So, at his hearing in front of the committee in Parliament, Clive declared that he had shown admirable restraint after the Battle of Plassey. Let's have a look at what he actually said. Consider the situation in which the victory at Plassey had placed me. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. Its richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. I walked through walls which were thrown open to me, piled on either hand with gold and jewels. Mr. Chairman, right now I stand astonished at my moderation. So, after reading the extract, it is clear that Clive was not remorseful. He was not guilty of whatever happened in Bengal about Battle of Plassey. Thousands were killed, trade was destroyed. So, at his hearing, he said that he restrained himself despite all the privileges offered to him after the Battle of Plassey. So, as per him, when the ruler, the rich bankers and traders, they all came to him, providing and giving gold, gifts, metals, jewels, etc., he controlled himself and only moderately used the riches. The company rule expanded. Now let's have a look how the company expanded its rule throughout the Indian subcontinent. So earlier, as we saw, that the East India Company was only located in Bengal and some villages around it. Then how did it spread to other parts of the country and started to rule India as a sole power? So, the key aspect of company's policy from 1757 to 1857 for the span of 100 years was, during this period of 100 years, the company rarely launched a direct attack on an unknown territory where it did not rule earlier. So, one of the biggest things was it never launched a direct act on any unknown territory. So, they tried political, economic, diplomatic measures in order to annex the kingdom. They started to talk with kings so that they would surrender themselves, or economic benefits that were provided to rich rulers. Diplomatic measures were taken so that the kings and rulers would already surrender to them. So, these three things are important to note here. Role of residents of the state. Now, what role did the residents of that particular province or state play? Now, residents were appointed after the Battle of Buxa in 1764. They were commercial or political agents to serve the interests of the company. Now, you would ask, who are residents? Residents does not mean you or me living in a state or a country. No, it was not the same as it is now. Residents were commercial or political agents, people who were responsible to use commerce or trade or political things in order to serve the best interests of the company. So, through them, through these residents, the company started to meddle, to interfere with the internal matters of the states, such as appointment of successors, administrative posts, officers, etc. Let's have a look at what the system of subsidiary alliance means. So, what is a subsidiary alliance? So, the East India Company, the Britishers, they started to demand and talk with different states for a subsidiary alliance. I hope you understand the meaning of alliance. Alliance is coming of two powers together. So, the Britishers established themselves as the supreme power. So, whichever state wanted to sign this treaty of subsidiary alliance, they had to accept the English as the supreme authority. So, the East India Company believed as a guardian of the state. So, the East India Company, they would become as a guardian of the state. Appointment of resident. The residents were appointed. The state kept on English resident in their court. So, whatever court of order the king had, there was one person who was representing the East India Company. These were known as residents. They used to check on the activities and policies of that particular state. So, keeping of an English army. Now, these Indian rulers, they were not allowed to have their own army. They were supposed to have an English army only in order to protect the state from any kind of attack. So the state had to keep an English army so that they could prevent any kind of external or internal invasion. The state had to bear the financial burden of the army. So all the resources and expenditure on maintaining that army was done by the ruler himself. Now, giving to the territory. The next important point to note here is that territory, the land was given. So, whenever, as soon as the Indian rulers, they failed to make payments or collect revenue and give that revenue, transfer that revenue to the East Indian Company, a part of their territory was taken away as penalty. So this is how the Britishers, they started to conquer land and settlements as well. For example, the Nawab of Awadh, he failed to make payments to the East India Company. So in return, he was forced to pay half of his territory to the company in 1801. Hyderabad was also forced to cede territories on similar grounds. So, protection by the English. Now, the next important point of this subsidiary alliance is protection by the English. So, in return, the kings, the rulers, the Nawabs, they were paying revenue and taxes to the East India Company. They were providing supreme power to the company and Britishers. In return, what were they getting? They were promised protection. What kind of protection? So, in return for the above mentioned conditions, the English company, they promised to protect the state from enemies or any kind of invasion. They also promised the state to not to interfere in the internal affairs and administration as to the policy making by the Britishers. So, they also promised that the company would not meddle or interfere in the policy decisions or administrative things of the state. However, this promise was seldom kept by the company. What power did the resident have? As we discussed, there were residents in the court of local state rulers. Now, what were the powers of this resident? Let's see. This is what James Mill, the famous economist and political philosopher from Scotland, wrote about the residents appointed by the company. So, we place a resident who really is king of the country. Whatever injunctions of non-interference he may say. So, as long as the prince acts in perfect subservience and does what is agreed to the residents, that is to the British government, things go on quietly. They are managed without the resident appearing much in the administration of affairs. So, what we see here, that till the time the prince and the kings, they were doing what was asked them and what was expected by the British government, the resident did not came into force. But what about when they incomplied? So, but when anything of a different nature happens, the moment the prince takes a course which the British government does not favor or does not want, then comes the clashes and disturbances. So, here is a picture of Nawab Sujaruddillah of Awadh, who was forced to give half of his territory to the Britishers. So, Tipu Sultan. Now, let's talk about Tipu Sultan, known as the Tiger of Mysore. Why is he so famous? How did he compete and battled against the East India Company and the Britishers? Let's have a look. Mysore was captured by the Britishers. The company took directly military control and confrontation when there was a threat to the political and economic interests of the company. So, they captured Mysore. Let's see how did Mysore became so strong. Mysore became strong under Hyder Ali, who ruled Mysore between 1761 to 1782, and his famous son Tipu Sultan, who ruled Mysore between 1782 to 1799. Mysore controlled the profitable trade of pepper. So, pepper is referred to as the black gold. So, the trade of spices was done through Mysore. It was a profitable trade of pepper, cardamom from the Malabar coast. In 1785, Tipu Sultan, he stopped the export of sandalwood. He stopped export and trade of sandalwood to the foreign parties. Pepper and cardamom through the ports of his kingdom. So, pepper, cardamom and sandalwood, they were stopped to trade and they were no longer exported from Malabar coast. So he also disallowed local merchants from trading with the company. What he did was he disallowed the local merchants, the native merchants to trade with the company. He set up close relationships with the French in India instead. So disallowing all the trade with the East India Company, he rather traded with the French. He also modernized in his army with their help. So he tried to learn new strategical and warship techniques and trained his army. The British saw Hyder and Tipu Sultan as ambitious, arrogant and dangerous because they posed a threat to their power in that region. They decided to control and crush them, destroy them completely. 4 wars were fought between Mysore and the East India Company. So these 4 wars were fought in 1767 to 1769, from 80 to 84, 1790 to 92, and then the final war in 1799. It was only in the last the company won the battle of Seringapatam and took full control of the Mysore region. So Tipu Sultan, as a result of that battle of Seringapatam, Tipu Sultan was killed, defeating his capital Seringapatam. Mysore was placed under the formal ruling dynasty of Vodiyars. So these people, these new dynasty Vodiyars, they were puppets for the East India Company. A subsidiary alliance was then imposed on the state. So here you can see a picture where Lord Cornwallis is receiving the sons of Tipu Sultan as hostages. The company forces were defeated by Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan in several battles. But in 1792, they were attacked by combined forces of Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad as well. Tipu was forced to sign a treaty with the Britishers by which the two sons of Tipu Sultan, they were taken away as hostages, and the British painters have painted that thing. So let's talk about the terms of treaty that was signed between Tipu Sultan and the East India Company in 1792. In 1792, when there was the battle, the forces of the Marathas, Nizam of Hyderabad and the company, they collectively attacked Mysore. So as a result, he failed the battle and he lost the battle. And he had to sign a treaty with the company under which his two sons were held as hostages by the company and Britishers. Now, the legend about Tipu Sultan and the glory that he possessed. Now, as you can see here a picture of Tipu Sultan. According to the legend, once Tipu Sultan had gone for hunting with his French friend, where he encountered a tiger. His gun did not work and his dagger fell. He fought barehanded with the tiger. And he managed to pick up his dagger. He finally killed the tiger, and since then he is known as the Tiger of Mysore. So here they explain us why the title, the Tiger of Mysore, was given to Tipu Sultan. So Tipu Sultan's toy tiger. Now here is an image of a toy tiger. Since he was known as the Tiger of Mysore, he had a toy tiger which was kept in his coat to scare away the British generals and officers. Now let's talk about the war with the Marathas. The late 18th century saw the company curb eventually and destroy the Maratha power. They first gained control of the Marathas, then later on they completely destroyed the Maratha powers. So the Marathas, they were defeated in the third battle of Panipat in 1761. So there was a battle of Panipat which happened between the Maratha leaders and the East India Company. And in the third battle of Panipat, the Marathas were completely destroyed. So with Ahmad Shah Abdali and their dream of ruling from Delhi failed. The Marathas, the ruler Ahmad Shah Abdali, he had a dream that he would rule the Indian subcontinent from Delhi, from the center power. That was completely destroyed. So they were divided into many states under different chiefs known as Sardars. So the Maratha kingdom or the power, they were divided into different small states, and these states were controlled and administered by Sardars belonging to different dynasties like Sindhia, who belonged to Gwalior, Holkar, who belonged to Indore, Gaikwad, who belonged to Baroda and Bhosle, Satara from Kolhapur. So these Maratha chiefs, they all were held together in a confederate under a Peshwa, who was a principal minister of the Maratha power. So the Marathas, they were always fighting battles. They were always busy in fighting the battles. Sometimes it was Panipat, then with Mysore, etc. So in the first war, which came to an end in 1782 with the Treaty of Salbai, no side won the war. So in this, neither the Britishers nor the Maratha power, they won. So this came with the Treaty of Salbai. The second Anglo-Maratha war was fought between 1803 to 1805, and this was fought on different fronts. So it was not just one place where the battle was fought, it was on different areas and regions. This resulted the Britishers winning in Odisha and the territories of the north side of the Yamuna river, which included Agra and Delhi. So the Britishers later on, after winning the battle, they captured Odisha and the areas above the Yamuna river, which are Agra and Delhi. So the third Anglo-Maratha war was between 1817 to 1819, and this completely crushed the Maratha power. The Peshwas, they were removed and sent away to Bithur near Kanpur with the person. The company now had complete control over the territories south of the Vindhyas. So as we have seen in the Indian map, Vindhyas are the mountain ranges in the southern or the Deccan Plateau. So the area and the region in the south of the Vindhyas, this is completely controlled by the company. So now the claim to the paramountcy. From the early 19th century, the company succeeded in territorial expansion. There were several battles that were fought, and gradually the company, they started to win. There was a drill of winning each and every battle, and that is how they expanded their territories. Under the Lord Hastings, there was a Lord Hastings, a person who was appointed as the Governor General from 1830 to 1823. The company initiated a new policy of paramountcy. Here you can see the image of Lord Hastings. Now what is it about? What is the policy of paramountcy? Now it claimed its authority to paramount, or the supreme, the topmost of everything, and it justified its annexing or threatening to annex any state, province or Indian kingdom. This view continued to guide later in the British policies as well. So, the process of expanding the territories did not go unchallenged. Of course, the Indian rulers, not every Indian ruler, they were surrendering. There were battles, they fought and rebelled against it, and it did not go unchallenged. So, when the Britishers, they tried to annex the small state of Kittur in Karnataka, Rani Chinnamma took to arms and led an anti-British resistance movement. So when they wanted to capture Kittur, which is in Karnataka, Rani Chinnamma, she led the pack and challenged the Britishers. She was arrested in 1824 and died in prison in 1829. But Raina, a poor chokidar of Sangoli in Kittur, carried on her resistance. So even the local people, they were motivated by this resistance, and they did not sit quiet. They led huge armies against the Britishers. He, with popular support, destroyed many British camps and records. He was caught and hanged by the British in 1830 for the rebellion. In the late 1830s, the East India Company became worried of Russia's expansion as well. So the French came, the Portuguese came, the Dutch came. They were all removed and eliminated by the Britishers. But now in 1830s, they were worried about the Russian expansion across Asia and probable entry into Indian subcontinent from the northwestern part of the state. So because of this fear, the British now wanted to secure their control over the northwestern part as well. They fought a prolonged war with the Afghanistan between 1838 and 1842, and they set up indirect company rule over there. So it was not direct, it was in collaboration and in form of alliance with the local bodies that they set up their rule over there. Sindh was taken over in 1843. They tried to annex Punjab, but Maharaja Ranjit Singh held back to the company, they tried to conquer Punjab as well, but the Sikh ruler Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he was so resistant that he did not let that happen. After his death in 1839, two prolonged wars were fought with the Sikh kingdom as well. So, here is an image of Maharaja Ranjit Singh holding his coat. Now, let's talk about doctrine of lapse. So, this is a very important topic and this will make you understand how did the Britishers they expanded further. Major features of doctrine of lapse were that the final wave of annexations, the conquer or gaining the control of territories, it started to occur under Lord Dalhousie, who was the Governor General under 1848 to 1856. Now you know we have a town known as Dalhousie. That town is named after him. So major features, what were the major features of this doctrine of lapse? So he devised and implemented and formulated a policy which was named the doctrine of lapse. The doctrine declared that if any Indian ruler died without a male heir or a male prince who could succeed the kingdom and lead it, that kingdom would lapse. It would become a part of the company territory. So what did the doctrine say? That if any Indian ruler died without a male heir, as in the prince who was supposed to become the king, the kingdom would lapse and become part of the company territory. So the company annexed several kingdoms just by this doctrine. There were several kingdoms which were annexed, conquered and being controlled by the company just under this doctrine. These kingdoms include Satara, Udaipur, Nagpur, Jhansi, Sambalpur, etc. At last the company also annexed Awadh in 1856. Now, this time the British, they argued that they were obliged by the duty to take over Awadh in order to free the people from the misgovernment of the Nawab. So they had their excuses to justify what they were doing. So here in this map you can see that how the Britishers they only controlled small parts of India at early time. The yellow ones are the areas under British rule and the pink ones are the areas which are not under the British rule. Now, as you can see the change after so many battles and doctrine of lapse, how the British territories that extended thoroughly. Of course, the Britishers they used to rule handful of places, for example Bengal, a part of Odisha, in south, etc. Later on, let's see what happened. So, as you can see in this map, the areas under British rule, it expanded and the Indian rulers, Indian territories of the local rulers, it was decreased. So, setting up a new administration. Now, of course, as the territories expanded, there was a need to set up new administrative systems. Now, let's have a look at the administration of Warren Hastings and what he proposed. Warren Hastings, he divided the British territories into small administrative units which are known as presidencies. So, if you are asked what are presidencies, these are small units controlled by Britishers. So, there were mainly three presidencies: Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. Each presidency was ruled by a governor. The supreme head was the Governor General. Okay, and they were further divided into districts. So, of course, if you have three presidencies like we have states today, and these presidencies then were further divided into districts and towns and cities. Now, the new system of justice was also established. There was a need to maintain law and order and new system of justice was established. Each district had two courts, criminal court and a civil court. So, criminal court was against the people who committed crimes and the civil court was to resort and give justice of civil matters. So, criminal courts were still under a Qazi and a Mufti, but under the supervision of district collectors. To bring uniformity, Hindu and Muslim laws were compiled so that there is uniformity to maintain law and order. Under the Regulation Act of 1773, Supreme Court was also established. So Supreme Court was the place where all the orders, court and law and order was maintained. So the principal figure was the collector, who collected revenue and maintained law and order in the presidency and provinces. There was a problem of interpretation of law by the local pandits and qazis. A major problem was that Brahmin Pandits gave different interpretation of local laws based on different schools of Dharmastra. So, to bring uniformity, in 1775, 11 Pandits were asked to compile a digest of Hindu laws. So, the Hindu law book was made, which is even followed now. N.B. Halhad translated a digest into English so that it could be practiced and understood by the Britishers as well. By 1778, a code of Muslim law was also compiled for the benefits of European judges, because two kinds of religions were there, two kinds of people were living in the subcontinent. There was requirement for two other kinds of laws guided by religion. Under the Regulation Act of 1773, a new Supreme Court was set up. Another court of appeal was set up at Calcutta by the name of Sadar Nizamat Adalat, which still exists, so you can visit there. The collector, a collector was put as the head and the chief of these courts and these provinces, and he used to collect revenues, taxes, maintain law and order, implement policies, etc. Police officers and darogas were also put up and appointed in order to check day-to-day supervision of activities in the districts. His office, the collectorate, the office of collector was known as the collectorate. It became the new center of power and the patronage that steadily replaced other authorities in the cities. So, here is an image of one such collectorate. Later on, Warren Hastings, he was impeached. So, here is an extract by Edmund Burke's eloquent speech during the impeachment of Warren Hastings. So, I impeach him in the name of people of India, whose rights he has trodden under his foot and whose country he has turned into a desert. Lastly, in the name of human nature itself, in the name of both sexes, in the name of every age, in the name of every rank, I impeach the common enemy and oppressor of all. So, the highlight of Edmund Burke's speech. What was the highlight? What did we get and understood out of it? So, the highlight was that Warren Hastings was responsible for the decline of the Indian people and the Indian subcontinent. So, Burke's speech notes that Hastings was the person who resulted in the desertation of India and trodden the rights of Indians. He should be impeached in the name of humanity. Let's talk about the company army. So, a new administration was set up. So, the company required a new form of army so that battles could be fought, so that it could protect its interests. So, the Mughal army was mainly composed of cavalry, the ghudsawars, who were trained soldiers on horseback, and the infantry, the pedal soldiers, who used to walk on feet. They were trained in archery and the use of sword. The cavalry, they had to play a major role in the army, and the Mughal state did not feel the need to have a large professionally trained army. So, in the rural areas, a large number of people who were armed peasants. The local zamindars, they supplied the Mughals with pedal soldiers at that time. So, here is an image of a ghudsawar. We have spoken about the early army in the Mughal Empire, but what about the army of the East India Company? So, the East India Company, they adopted its own method when it began recruiting for the army. It was known as the sepoy system, from the Indian word sipahi, meaning soldier. So, there was a change in the warfare technology. Different kinds of weapons were used, different kinds of things were used, and techniques and strategies developed. In the 1820s, the cavalry needs of the company, they declined, because the British Empire was fighting against in Burma, Afghanistan and Egypt. So, there was not just one war, there were several wars in different countries. There, the soldiers were armed with muskets and matchlocks. So this is a kind of weapon which was used at that time, which are known as musket and matchlocks. So next, the soldiers, they had to keep pace with changing military requirements. There was a need for upgradation. Its infantry regiments now became more important. So the infantry regiments, these all things, they became more important. In the early 19th century, the Britishers, they began to develop a uniform military culture. That means that they used to train every sepoy, every soldier uniformly using one technique and strategical method. Soldiers, they were given European style training, drill and discipline. So it was not flexible like it used to be. Now it became more disciplined. They regulated their life far more than before. What they would eat, when they will sleep, where will they live, etc. Often they created problems because a feeling of caste and community was ignored in building a force of professional soldiers. What happened was, the new steam technology was helpful for the company. The East India Company, they transformed from trading company to a territorial colonial power. This was also aided by new steam technology which used in engines of ships, trains, etc. This reduced the timing, the transportation timing as well. It was efficient. Earlier, time taken for this journey was 6 to 8 months, which was reduced to 3 weeks. So the time was saved. This enabled more and more Britishers and their families to come from far off lands and establish and settle in India. Now, East India Company had virtually controlled the whole of the country by 1857. In 1857, the East India Company came to exercise direct rule for about 63% of the territory and 78% of the population of the Indian subcontinent. Combined with its indirect influences, there were also some indirect forces on the remaining territory in terms of economic, finances, trade, etc. So, virtually the whole of India was under the control of the Britishers. Now let's talk about what was happening in the other parts of the world. Here is a story from South Africa. There was a slave trade going in South Africa. The Dutch trading companies, they reached in the southern part of Africa and they conquered the parts of South Africa. So what did they do here? So they took and conquered the people and made them slaves in their courts. They were asked to serve the British and English masters. They did not have any rights. The living conditions for these slaves, it was very cruel. So, and they were also shipped off and migrated or sold in markets to America and Europe. So, having learned that there was to be safe sale of cattle, farm stock, etc. auction, we halted our wagon for the purpose of procuring fresh oxen. When slavery ended in 1837, there were about 36,774 privately owned slaves at the Cape located in the southernmost tip of Africa. So imagine the ruckus, the havoc they created. So what have we learnt in this chapter so far? We learnt about how the East India Company, it came to India and it established its root in India. And this led to a series of battles in the Indian subcontinent. Apart from that, we learned who was Tipu Sultan and how did he came to be known as the Tiger of Mysore. We saw what were the challenges and how the East India Company, it captured most of the territorial regions in the Indian subcontinent. Moreover, we learnt that there was a new administrative which was implemented and a new system, new training policy for army was established. So, apart from that, we saw what was happening with the slaves in South Africa. So, I hope you understood everything. Thank you.